if I put my therapist hat on, the I mean, there is this sense of dysregulation that we're all experiencing, right? And based on our history, some of us are better at self-regulating than others. Um, and not that that's a judgment at all, but sometimes we just need help and support from somebody else to help us get back to regulation, right? And when you've got all that's going on environmentally, like you said, it's easy to get dysregulated. And for all of us just to be aware about that emotional state that somebody else is in and at least acknowledge it, right? Like I'm a big proponent that we are all responsible for our emotional state. That is our responsibility to manage through that and figure that stuff out. But I think it's important for other people to be able to also make space and name it, right? So like there was a colleague inside of Keystone Alliance that was just in this place of hopelessness with regards to what has been all going on. And we just spent a few minutes before a meeting kind of naming that, acknowledging it, and talking about it. And then later on in the meeting, we were able to get to the action items, the to do list that we had to do. And there just began to emerge this sense of hope because the to do items, the actual actions, actually felt like there was some agency or some things that we could do. So I think it's just important for us to be mindful about what's going on in others. It doesn't have to be the people that report to you or that you report to, but you can do it for your colleagues and your peers to just when you notice something's off, name it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that you think about the number of meetings you've been in or I've been in where you're sitting there and there is setting aside the current state of things and something's cooking and you've got all this pressure in your head and
Yes.
you're like, okay, how in the world are we going to accomplish this thing on the table here today with everything that I know is cooking? And it's actually
Yes.
an interesting thing that I hope continues post whatever this phase is that we're in, where you can just say, yo, you know what, right now I'm not able to be present. I need to just pause. And it's
Mhm.
like, yeah, that's great. Take care of yourself. And we can revisit when we're ready versus nope, you gotta press through and find a way to suffer just for a little bit longer. It's like, no, that's not the human way to do it or the
Yeah.
humane way to do it.
And yet there's a balance, right? And it's like that to me is that magic. Like, how do you walk that line, right? How do
Yeah.
you acknowledge it, or how do you be able to say, "Hey, I need a mental health day," without feeling as though you're being taken advantage of, or that you're focused too much on the personal and not enough on the work that needs to be done. Like how do you, like to me that's always the trick. And I don't know if there's one right answer, right? Because I think that line is very different for all of us to dance. But I'm curious as to what's like, how is that for you? For like, how do you balance that?
I don't have a good answer aside from more burritos. But it really is. It is honestly, it is in the morning. The last month or so, typically I'll get up, caffeinate, and race out of the house to get to my desk, and that window has gotten a little bit longer where it's like, you know what, I can hang out with the dog, make sure I get to as close to genius on my spelling bee for the day as possible, and have a cup of coffee at a more leisurely pace because the speed at which I start a day, I've noticed kind of impacts the rest of the day and especially the impact I have on other people.
Yeah.
So if I can get off to a more steady start, I can hopefully have a more balanced impact and kind of just vibe throughout the day.
Yeah, I think that really speaks well to this notion that there's a connection between emotional intelligence and developing that skill and good leadership.
Hmm. Yeah, I have no such connection. The
That's not true though. I
one of
think
my
I just let but let's just pause here for a second because That's just it. A lot of leaders are very humble, right? And humility is really important in leadership and important in, I think, just professional life. But I also don't want to dismiss, right, just in general and specific to you, this kind of connection between emotional intelligence and leadership, right? And it's not something you have or you don't have, right? And it's not something you're good at or you're bad at. It is a skill that is always developed. It's a muscle that always gets developed, right? If you don't pay attention to emotional intelligence and how you're scanning the environment emotionally, that muscle atrophies, right? It loses strength. So it's never a destination, emotional intelligence. And I think that, so often we think of it as I either have it or I don't. I'm good at it
Mhm.
or I'm bad at it. And I want to reframe that it is something we always have to work at.
Yeah, no, that resonates very strongly. That's for sure. It's almost like a pendulum. You know what I mean? Like how much, like when you're balancing, it's like there's always, you're never going to be dead center and it's never going to be
Yes.
perfect, right? But it's like, are you at least aware that you're trying to hit that
Yes.
middle a little bit more than the extremes? And
Yep. That's a good visual. That's a good
um,
visual.
one of my all of our nonprofit friends are going to watch this amazing fireside chat that has no fire. But I need to quote my buddy Dory. She and I had a lot of conversations around kind of this notion of work life balance,
Mm,
especially in the nonprofit world. It's kind of a fallacy,
hmm.
like you're not in the nonprofit field, the social impact field, in a leadership role. I mean, usually that's many decades to get to that kind of a position, and like you're in it, mind, body, and soul. Otherwise, you wouldn't have
Right.
stayed.
Right.
And so it is. I think for those of us who are wired that way, and I definitely identify, it makes these times that much more challenging because it's like, what we're always going to have? We're always going to have a social need to be addressed, and it's this eternal field. But right now, it's
Yeah.
like, again, that interrupting force, like, oh man, it almost feels, potentially existential. And it's where do you find your anchors in the face of that so you're not as far adrift.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you touch on a topic that at least for me, has been a lot where I've at least had a lot of it, kind of attention to it and kind of trying to process what does that mean for me, right? And this is around this kind of like we want to be able to compartmentalize things, right? You have work, you have personal, right? And you've got a balance between those two things versus this idea that they're all blended, right? And we've talked about this before that how we come to work and how we show up to work is all grounded in our families of origin or the families that we grew up in, right? And so we learn how to be in relationship. We learn communication rules based on the families that we grew up in. And we all have different families, right? Which means we all have different sets of rules on what relationships should be like and what communication should be like. And the challenge for leadership is how do you blend that, right? How do you get that to be aligned across all of these different employees? And to me, that's just another example about how we try to have this artificial division between personal and professional when it is personal because work is made up of human beings, right? And we all come with different sets of expectations and rules of how we engage with one another. And so it is personal. The professional is personal. And there is no such thing between a work life balance because it all gets blended together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we need to order in more office wide lunches, I think, to answer the question.
That
Wow, I didn't
consist of
realize I was this.
burritos.
I didn't realize I was this food obsessed. That's hilarious. I mean, I did, but I keep on I'm not intentionally going back to that metaphor.
So let's talk a little bit more about kind of like the mechanics of things, right? Like, there's this, typically when you've got things like a government shutdown, people are feeling the pressures of cash flow and This pressure of having enough revenue coming in. And so again, this is kind of like this being able to honor those pressures, right? And monitor those things and a need to monitor those things alongside of needing to balance the bandwidth of staff. And how are you doing that right now? How are you doing that within Keystone Alliance?
Um, I personally am very lucky to have an amazing team, and we specialize in back office stuff to a large degree. So, I mean, we have we have fluency in a lot of systems and things that are built up all around those areas, and our particular our service and mission affiliates, meaning Glenkirk and Search, their funding all flows primarily through the state Medicaid system via one of the specialized waivers for adults with developmental disabilities. So we have fewer direct threats for programmatic funding, where I know folks who have different funding structures have, in some cases, direct threats where there's, the spigot just got turned off immediately on, 12:01 a.m. on October 1st for certain programs. And so then in that case, we would go into kind of what's the cash flow on this? How can we, borrow from internal resource A to fund this to have it bridge over? And so again, for us, it's that kind of awareness of where do we know the risks are, because you always know, like if time were infinite, you'd you know crawl all over everything, but where are the things that we think are bigger, that if we if the spigot were to get turned off for our specific type of funding, what would we where would our risk points be? And so we're looking into a couple programs that have kind of been at the back of our minds for the last 2 fiscal years. Now we're moving it up to the front and saying, okay, if our external capacity building work is on pause, let's look inward and make sure that this particular program within this particular cost center is as sustainable as humanly possible, so that we're happy later if and when it hits the fan on that particular front.
So you might not have very specific contingency plans written in place, but you
Right.
certainly are running those scenarios with
Absolutely.
the
Absolutely.
two other organizations leadership as we speak.
Yep. And it's hanging out with your, I mean, nonprofits tend to enjoy long-term banking relationships, and it's we get a lot of support from our bank outside of the kind of typical transactions, and lending relationships. And so making contact with those representatives, just they know what's going on. They're paying closer attention than we are to the fiscal aspects of it, but just to make sure that if there's an additional liquidity need, they're aware of it. You can see what the shape of it looks like, order of magnitude, and so that if that comes to pass, you have things in place where you're not starting the conversation in the time when the crisis is peaking, but it's we want to take this off the shelf.
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about kind of being in partnership, right? It
Yeah.
is like in these times where we want to hunker down and isolate, we really need to be reaching out and having conversations